Okay, it looks like the participant list is holding stable for the time being. So we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the final presentations for this year's University of Washington Data Science for Social Good program. The program is hosted by the eScience Institute, which is a campus-wide hub for data science training, collaboration, and research. I'm Anissa Tanweer. I currently serve as the program chair for DSSG, but I've been involved with this program in some capacity or another since it started in 2015. And over the years, it's been really great to be a part of the evolution of the program and also to see enthusiasm for this kind of work more broadly really grow. So there are now at least 10 similar programs at universities around the world. And in just this past year, we launched a network of those programs to try to learn from our collective experiences and also to help institutions who are interested in starting similar programs get going. And in just the next few months, we'll be getting some of our findings from that work out into the world in the form of what we're calling a growth map for Data for Good programs. So have that on your radar and be on the lookout for that. And I think one of the signs that this field of data science for social good is really maturing is that we're approaching the work that we do with a healthy dose of humility. So the name of our program is an aspiration, and we know that saying we're doing good isn't the same thing as actually doing good. We understand that there isn't a quick technological fix for many of the problems we're addressing because they're often systemic and enduring. And we have this very brief 10-week window to work with in the summer. And so we realized that we're not necessarily, or that we are necessarily building on and complementing continuing efforts of people and organizations who are really in it for the long haul in working for more fairness and equity and prosperity and well-being in our society. And in these very short 10 weeks of the summer program, our DSSG fellows are tasked with a really tall order. They have to learn about an entirely new subject matter and come to understand the larger context of the questions they're addressing. They have to learn to communicate and collaborate across really dramatically interdisciplinary teams. They have to build relationships with stakeholders who are either involved in their work or affected by it. They have to learn the ins and outs of a new data set, how it came to be, what it means, what its limitations are. And of course, they have to learn new methods and tools and sharpen their analytic skills. And as you see, you will see in their presentations today, our fellows this year really rose to that challenge with gusto, and we really couldn't be more proud of them. Before I turn the mic over and get you one step closer to hearing directly from them, which is what I know you're all here for, I just want to make a couple of acknowledgements. First, Emily Keller is our program coordinator, and she's so vital to keeping all the moving parts of this program spinning smoothly. And Sarah Stone, as the executive director of eScience, has been the staunchest possible champion of this program. She both guides the bigger vision and also fully engages with every detail of running it. And finally, although this gathering today is virtual, each of us is very much connected to the land we live and work upon. We can't forget its importance or its history. For those of us at the University of Washington, that means acknowledging that we work on the homelands and traditional territories of the Duwamish, Suquamish, and other Coast Salish nations. And with that, I will turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Anissa. Part of what makes this very special program possible is the support of an Advancing Curiosity Award from the Micron Foundation, which provides things like student stipends, scholarships, and remote work resources in these remote times. Also, continuing support from the University of Washington is really essential to us being able to support this kind of complex program. So we're really delighted to welcome Dr. Nancy Alberton, the University of Washington Frank and Julie Jungers Dean of Engineering. Alberton also holds an appointment in the UW's Department of Bioengineering and is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineering, and the National Academy of Inventors. We're so delighted to have you here today, Dean.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm excited to be here and to welcome everyone to the Data Science for Social Good final presentations. I think you're going to see some really quite amazing and creative work for our students, so stay tuned. And I also want to underscore that the College of Engineering is really embracing data science for social good. We have a strategic plan, and this will be a core component, social good, of our strategic plan. So we're all on board. I spoke last year at this event, but I see a whole new set of fresh ideas and collaboration. So it's just amazing at the enthusiasm and just creativeness from our students just keeps rolling out. I'm really excited and impressed by this year's topics. Fairness and computational redistricting, but I'm also really excited to hear about Seattle's new minimum wage law and the fairness of that law. I think this program is just a perfect way to showcase not only social impact, but collaborations across many, many different disciplines, people coming to work together to really solve important problems that our society is challenged with. So again, really enthusiastic about this whole team effort. On a similar note, I have some exciting news about the College of Engineering. We just received an NSF award for a UW-led AI Institute for Dynamic Systems. I think it's going to plug in with the whole theme of social good and data science really nicely and help support this effort also as we move forward. So stay tuned for more in the future. And on top of collaborations across this really nice interdisciplinary group of people, I want to just say that Micron has been really a great collaborator for the College of Engineering, a strong partner, and I think their commitment to social good really exemplifies the College of Engineering and where we want to go now and in the future. So DEI, data science, how we can make the world a much better place for everyone. And so the other thing I would like to introduce is Eric Byers. He has been a tremendous partner for the College of Engineering. He's Vice President of DRAM and Emerging Memory Process Development at Micron, and he'll say a few remarks in a minute. But the first thing I want to showcase is that we are super proud of Eric because he's a 94 grad of the Chemical Engineering Department here in the College of Engineering at UW. He immediately then joined Micron, where he served in a number of leadership roles. He's led both small and leadership teams in R&D, and he's even had time away in Japan working on collaborative projects. Eric is already quite accomplished. He has 15 patents in the area of semiconductor multi-patterning and image optimization. And so I also want to say that he's just a very enthusiastic husky, so go dogs. And he's been a huge advocate again, and an integral partnership. He makes our partnership with Micron really smooth and highly productive. So Eric, thank you, and take it away.
Okay, thanks Nancy for the introduction. I've got my Go Micron in the background, but as Nancy said, I've always got the Go Dogs going most of the time with most of the clothes I wear as well. I get to give a quick introduction to Micron. You may know us from our products. We design, develop, manufacture industry-leading DRAM and NAND memory and storage products. We're in your phones, we're in your laptops. We power the data centers used by the likes of Google and Facebook. And by providing foundational capability for innovations like AI, 5G, across data center, the edge, consumer devices, we unlock innovation across industries, including healthcare, automotive, communications. So our technology and expertise, we're central to maximizing value from cutting edge computing applications and new business models, which both disrupt and advance the industry. We are a company based on innovation, tenacity, collaboration. Those are some of our core values. We're an international company. Nancy mentioned I spent time in Japan. We actually are across 17 different countries. from domestic R&D site, which is right here in Boise, Idaho, where Scott and I are today, to international R&D and manufacturing center of excellence in Japan, Taiwan, and Singapore in particular. But those are all great things about our company, but behind those innovations, the patents, the centers of excellence are the people. There's some 40,000 of us across those 17 countries. So we've really come to cherish what the diversity of culture and thought brings to our business success. And that's reflected in our corporate vision, which is transform how the world uses information to enrich life for all. And what better platform could we have to demonstrate the use of information to enrich life for all than the Data Science for Social Good programs? Both projects that you've been working on the past 10 weeks are important for us to learn about and integrate into our conversations and decisions. They're complicated, sometimes controversial topics, but these are conversations that need to happen as hard as they might be. And one thing that really amazes me is these teams' ability to take these super complex problems, topics, use data science to draw objective conclusions and recommendations, and honestly, you make it look simple to do in the process, which is pretty amazing to me. The understanding and sharing of your conclusions will help bring clarity for all of us to use and provide a base for factual dissemination of findings. So in partnership with the foundation, we're super pleased to provide funding for the UW DSSG program for the second year in a row. To all the students and fellows, thanks for your time and dedication on the projects this summer. Anissa gave a great intro to the complexities that you've undertaken for the last 10 weeks. So our time is short. I would like to introduce Scott Gatzmeyer, our VP of Yield Technology and Data Science. He's going to share a few words specifically about data science and its importance in the future of engineering at Micron, but also just throughout our industry.
Thanks, Eric. So yeah, I'm very excited for the presentations today to see the final results. I've been working with these teams and seeing their presentations at the midpoint. So very excited for the work. I know they put in a tremendous amount of hard work. At Micron, I'm really also excited about the future of data science and the skills that you're learning as you go through this program, the exploratory data analysis, the coding work, the modeling, the visualization tools. Those are all transferable skills that go in directly to making the products that we make here at Micron. And really see this as the future of engineering. Engineers used to use slide rules, then Excel, then Jump. Really see data science being an extension of engineering and eventually combining that and enabling us to make the products that we make at the subatomic scales that we do. So very, very excited about what that could be. The other thing that really excited about, and Eric highlighted it, our vision statement, transforming how the world uses information to enrich life for all, really applaud the Data Science for Social Good program, and contributing back here is how we really make our products for all. So very excited about that as well. And with that, I'll pass it back to Sarah to introduce the first team.
Thank you so much, Scott and Eric and Nancy, for taking the time to join us today. We're so grateful for your ongoing support and the dedication that you all show to this program and to the student fellows and to the important work that they're doing. So without further ado, I would love to introduce you to our first team, the minimum wage team. We always have a little shorthand in-house that we call these teams by, even though they have much longer official names. I'll just remind you, so we have 2 talks and there'll be a question and answer session following each of the talks. You're free to add your questions at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Our first group will be presenting on geography, equity, and the Seattle $15 minimum wage ordinance. So Chris, please go ahead with sharing your screen.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is James Lamar Foster, and I'm a Data Science for Social Good Fellow, along with Delaney Glass, Christopher Salazar, and Mahader Tamene. We're excited to share with you the work we have been conducting for the past 10 weeks on the Seattle 15 minimum wage ordinance and workers' mobility. But before we start, I have to acknowledge the leadership and support we received from our project lead, Jenny, and the eScience Institute data scientists, Jose and Valentina.
People are struggling to make ends meet. Despite movement for fair wages and a fight for 15 across many American cities, housing prices are rising faster than income, leading to increased rent burden and eventual displacement of many low-income, historically marginalized families. As one of the wealthiest cities in the US, Seattle serves as an epicenter and useful case study for how raised minimum wage policies and increased affluence intersect to impact low-wage workers and their families. Seattle passed a $15 minimum wage ordinance in 2014 that took effect in 2015. Simultaneously, the city experienced a large tech boom, which increased the population of high wage earners into the city. Exacerbated by the tech boom, housing prices have shot up faster than in any major city in the US for most of the past several years, and development of high-end luxury housing continue to pop up with fervor and speed. All of this has led to further gentrification and displacement of low-wage workers. Using rich longitudinal data known as WMLAD, which we'll talk about, our project explores the impacts of Seattle's $15 minimum wage ordinance on the city's low-wage workers in context of this coinciding tech boom and its consequences. And we do this by asking a few questions to really understand what the impacts are. We ask, who are low-wage workers and where do they live over time? And we define low wage as 2 times the Washington minimum wage. We'll talk a bit about that later. How much do they spend on housing? When we think about that, we're really interested in the extent of their rent burden, which we define as spending 30%, spending more than 30% of their monthly income on housing. Are they moving over time? We look at that by looking at changes in their home addresses, measuring it as move, and understanding the increased number of moves as a potential indicator of residential displacement or instability. And finally, what are changes in their commute patterns? We do this by looking at home and work address distances using the midpoint of census tract locations of these 2 locations.
So the next question for us is, how do we begin to answer some of these questions? And there have been some previous studies done, particularly from the University of Washington's minimum wage study that asked the initial question, what was the impact of the Seattle minimum wage on employment and earnings? And they did this by looking at employment security department data, which was available to them. And that information includes work locations, earnings, and hours worked. So you can begin to see, you can do some sort of analysis using this information. However, if you change the question to something from our study, for instance, how has work commute changed for Seattle workers over the implementation of the minimum wage ordinance? Well, now we're missing information. We don't have home locations, we don't have residential addresses. So there's no path to do some sort of analysis. So we need more data. And what we can start to do is actually introducing these other agencies from the state of Washington that do have a little bit more rich data. So for example, the Department of Social and Health Services or the Department of Licensing does have home and residential locations. So if we can merge this with the employment security data, we have this merged data set. This merged data set can have home locations, work locations, wages, and from then you can actually see a path to try to answer the question above. And so what that leads us to is this merging of all this information together in all these agencies, and that gives us to WMLAD. WMLAD stands for Washington Merged Longitudinal Administrative Data. And at a high level, it comprises of longitudinal and geo-encoded administrative data from these 7 state agencies from the state of Washington. Now, this is important because we're now able to dig deeper on some of these minimum wage type questions, because we have important social and economic indicators that will drive these questions a little bit further. And there's a few unique things about this. One, we actually have a lot of population captured here. For instance, we have millions of workers, millions of clients, and millions of voters. So we have a pretty large population. Another distinction about this type of data is that Washington State is one of 4 states in the nation that actually reports hours worked. And overall, this is just not something that's available to from cities and governments that provide for researchers to look at. So we're in a unique position that we're amongst the first to look at this data. And part of our goal is to set a foundation for working with this type of data. Now, we have to be very conscious of the fact that we are working with sensitive information here. We can identify a person, and we have to be very conscious about that. So any privacy guidelines we have to abide by. And so that really sort of structures our workflow. And that workflow is kind of demonstrated here and illustrated in this diagram. For starters, WMLAD is a lot of data. In its raw form, it's about 100 gigs worth of data. But as other researchers begin to add data frames and start doing their own analysis, this can really balloon up into the terabytes of data range. Now, when we talk about terabytes of data, we consider that to be big data, and big data has its own challenges to overcome. But just putting that aside for a moment, maybe a bigger question is, where do we store this data in a secure location? And the answer to that is the enclave, or so-called enclave. Now, the enclave is a remote server that's hosted by the Center for Studies in Demography and Ecology, and it's from the University of Washington. And it's just a place that we as researchers can actually log into. But there's one slight caveat to it, is that there's no connection to the internet. And for good reason, right? We don't want to be able to send files over and transfer files over the internet. But it does impact the entire workflow. We don't typically work in this environment. So for instance, Git or GitHub is a collaborative platform for programmers to use. And it really synchronizes well with the internet, but we don't have that. So we have to kind of work in a sort of version of it. RStudio and SQL are the coding platforms that we use. But again, everything has to be developed within the enclave. And within all of this, we have to make sure that we keep everything private and abide by all the privacy guidelines. So anything that comes out of the enclave has to be approved as an extra set of eyes. And what I'm really just trying to emphasize here is that we're not only working with big data, we're working with big, sensitive administrative data. So with that framework in mind, we can actually move on to some findings.
We want to emphasize that the findings we are about to discuss are exploratory and ongoing. Please contact our project lead, Jenny, if you would like to cite anything presented. The unit of analysis for our study are low-wage workers. As a result, we need to clearly define what it means to be a low-wage worker. After extensive review of the literature, we found that there is not a consensus for what constitutes a low-wage worker. For example, the Brookings Institute's 2019 report on low-wage workers defined low-wage workers as individuals making less than 2/3 the median wage for full-time workers. Furthermore, other studies have defined low-wage workers as people making less than $13 per hour or people making $25,000 a year. If we decided to use 2 times the Washington State minimum wage in order to account for inflation and the rising cost of goods and services. By doing this, the minimum wage for 2015 came out to be around $19 per hour, which aligned with Jardim and her colleagues' 2017 paper on the Seattle minimum wage, where they used a $19 cutoff for the 2016 Seattle workers. The next thing we wanted to do was understand who Seattle low-wage workers were. We found that the percentage of low-wage workers by race is proportionate to the racial makeup of the Puget Sound residents, as you can see by looking at this donut plot. The next thing we wanted to know was where low-wage Seattle workers lived over time. Take a moment to look at this animated map. The lighter colors indicate a higher proportion of low-wage Seattle workers. As time progresses, we see more and more low-wage workers. In particular, we see them moving further away from the Seattle region.
In addition to figuring out who the low-wage workers were and where they were living, we also were interested in how much these Seattle low-wage workers spend on housing. And so using public available data from Housing and Urban Development, we estimated which proportion of low-wage workers were likely to be rent burdened. In other words, they're spending greater than 30% of their earnings on rent. And in 2011, when the state minimum wage was around $8.67 per hour, you can see on the lower right that pretty much 100% or close to 100% of all low-wage workers in Seattle were rent burdened. And in 2016, there's a slight contrast. We do see a decrease in the proportion of workers, of low-wage workers who are rent burdened or likely rent burdened. And in the outskirts of the Puget Sound region, we actually see an increase. And so it could be that low-wage workers, or one explanation could be that low-wage workers are moving out of the city, or that the minimum wage increase is actually helping workers to afford their rent. However, in Seattle proper, it's also plausible that only the low-wage workers who can afford to stay are staying.
We also took a look at movement, trying to understand movement to really test this idea of whether low-wage workers are being displaced as a consequence of this influx of affluence into the city. So this graph looks at how many times Seattle workers have ever moved between 2010 and 2017, and really increased moves for us served as a potential indicator of displacement. And so we see a count of different moves on the x-axis, and you'll see the number of workers. And what we see is that low-wage workers have a greater number of total moves, being more likely to move 4+ times. And of note, the common cutoffs for defining high mobility or residential instability within the literature are about 3 or 4 moves. So these exploratory findings show some indication of displacement that's worth further exploration. In attempting to understand change in residence of Seattle workers over time, this following graph looks at the number of workers by wage status and residence, or where Seattle and non-Seattle residents live across time. And I just wanted to highlight a key point here, and that is over time, we see that the number of non-low wage workers living in Seattle, seen here in the purple, is increasing over time, which indicates a general proportional decrease of low wage workers living in Seattle. This supports the visualization Lamar showed earlier that highlights a proportion of low-wage workers living in the city decreasing over time, while proportion in the outskirts or outside of Seattle is increasing. So again, we're seeing some patterns indicating that low-wage workers are moving more frequently and likely moving out of the city and into the outskirts as time progresses.
And as we begin to answer the question of what changes in low-wage workers in their commuting patterns, one thing we have to keep in mind is that if we have home information and we have work information as well, if you really worked hard enough, you can actually identify a person based on some of these simple attributes. So a way to mitigate this is that we want to de-identify a person even further by looking at everything at the census tract level. So here you see an image of King County's census tracts. And every single blue dot represents the midpoint of that census tract. And the way that we go about this is, the midpoint itself is just some arbitrary point that's, again, just a midpoint. So what we do is we take every observation of an individual, we have a home location, and we tie their home location to some census tract, and that census tract is then tied to a census tract midpoint. Then that midpoint, we use the same thing for the work location. And then what we do is we connect the dots and we calculate some sort of commute based on those 2 points. So with this in mind, we can begin to have do some level of analysis. For instance, we can start to look at the average commuting distance for Seattle workers. And here we see this graph on the y-axis, we have average commuting distance in miles, and on the x-axis, we see the years over time. And upon first glance, we look at the wage brackets between low and non-low, with the red representing the low wage type workers. And if anything, we might say there's not really much of a difference considering the scale here. And also, if anything, we might even say that low wage workers might enjoy lower commute time in general. However, if we start to change the granularity of the wage bracket, now instead considering low wage workers, medium wage, and high wage, where low wage is still less than 2 times the minimum wage, medium between 2 and 4, and high is greater than 4. Well, perhaps we actually uncover a pattern here, or reveal something a little bit more closely. Now we see that the red line is actually, after 2013, begins to surpass the high wage worker commute. And again, this is just more of an exploratory, but I think it really points to the fact that this data can start to reveal these things because we can go to different levels of granularity overall. So again, just emphasizing the power of what this data can provide and what different things we can uncover.
And in some, among Seattle low-wage workers, we really do find some initial suspicions that rent burden persists over time, even if it was decreasing, and that low-wage workers tend to have greater moves overall and they are moving out of the city at a greater rate. And as a team, we really advocate that $15 is not enough. And this is in line with what many past labor and housing advocates are really pushing for. And we agree with this sentiment, and we believe that there should be more investment in publicly funded affordable housing and a greater minimum wage to address simultaneously the crises of housing and income inequality. And we really believe that our research here and that future WMLAD users can begin to sort of probe the effects of the minimum wage even further, in addition to our exploratory analysis. So for example, future researchers may consider doing some formal statistical modeling, perhaps predictive or inferential, to understand what happened in the past decade and then what might occur in the future when it comes to income inequality and basically the overall quality of life for low-wage workers. We also contend that they should use household level data. We mostly looked at individual data, and this can be particularly useful for things like rent burden, because rent burden is typically calculated at the household level rather than the individual level. We also believe that future researchers should build cohorts. Although the WMLAD data represents millions of observations and millions of people, we did not look at a longitudinal cohort over time in all of our analyses. And so we strongly believe that future researchers should build cohorts to better understand longitudinal change. And in doing so, they may also refine metrics to, for example, understand changes in commute patterns more at the different levels, zip code, census block, census tract, and then also to understand potential racial disparities among low-wage workers as well.
There are also some WMLAD considerations. First, we suggest people leverage administrative data. Once again, this data was not intended for statistical analyses. However, because it is exhaustive, researchers can use it to uncover issues that have policy implications by conducting geospatial analyses. However, users of administrative data need to use this data with a critical lens. This data is highly sensitive. Each observation is a person and should be treated as such. Lastly, the reason we were able to scratch the surface of this data is because there was an investment in collecting and merging all of this data. This kind of investment should not stop at 2017. There needs to be a continued investment in collecting and merging administrative data for future research and advocacy. And lastly, we want to conclude by thanking our many supporters and sponsors. This work would not have been possible without your collective effort. Thank you.
Wonderful job, you guys. Please, everyone, join me in a round of applause. Great presentation. We have a flood of questions coming in, and so I'll go ahead and get us started. We have a question that says, you're contrasting low-wage workers and non-low-wage workers. Are those populations, relatively stable? Or did you look at low-wage workers who moved out of that status, or at non-low-wage workers who moved into being low-wage workers?
So that's a great question, first off, and thank you for posing it. So I know, and I think Mahara can speak to this a little bit. In her analysis, she looked at people who continued to stay low wage, and then also people who who were also just always non-low wage. And so in that analysis, people did not move from low wage to non-low wage. And so there was a different analysis for that, what she was looking at.
Yeah, I think to add for the things that look at like total moves, for example, that's over the whole span of time, it was ever, if anyone was ever low wage. So there is a potential for someone to move within and in and out of. I think that is not additional analysis that we've done, but something that could be possible with this data set. Yeah.
Thanks, you guys. So I have another question. Great talk. That's part of the question. So I'll just extend that along to all of you, and you're seeing much of that coming through as well in the chat. It says, do you all know what happened in the data to make 2016 a trend breaking point in most plots? Is it a change in collection methodology or an incomplete year?
There are some underlying research that had been done beforehand that we're sort of dependent on. So for instance, there is both a racial and residential imputation to fill in information that was missing. And so there's a dependence on that. And as far as we understand, at sort of the extreme ends of that racial imputation and address imputation, it begins to get harder to accurately account for some of those for some of that imputation. It begins to get a little fuzzy at the extreme ends. It's a lot more clear to do interior points. So there are some things that go on sort of at the extreme ends of data that the merging and the matching may not be as exhaustive as the other previous years, and that could be a potential contributor to kind of seeing maybe less data or just less rich data within that one. And all the reason to sort of expand that data set a little bit further to get a bit of a holistic view, right?
Yeah, I think to add to Chris, I think could be like promising trends, but I think one of the things we were able to speak to a stakeholder at DSHS, and a lot of times I think with administrative data, what we may see as trend could be a way in which data collection was, a change in data collection or something. And to Chris's point, given that some of the data is through imputation and it does better in the middle and not the ends, this may not necessarily be a trend. So it would be something for further exploration.
We have a question about how well did the merge work? Was there a common identifier across all of the data sets? I know you showed us the enormous amount of data and the numerous data sets that you were working with. So how did that go?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was actually right in the middle of typing the answer out, so I'll answer it here. So there was a person at DSHS who created unique IDs for individuals, and because of that, we were able to link people from, for example, the ESD data to the DHS data. And so that was part of the linking part, and that's also part of the reason why this was somewhat costly, and there needs to be a greater investment in this type of work so that type of merging process can be done throughout many years.
Yeah, and Jenny, our project lead, has done some really nice figures for Venn diagrams of sort of overlapping information and unique IDs. So, but yeah, that's certainly a big challenge of all this, is making sense of what's merged, how well the matching does, and making sure that it's done correctly as well. It's just a big part of just wrapping your head around all these data points and all that. So. There's a good potential for merging here, and overall, I think there was a good overlap between things, and we were able to preserve a lot of information. But there certainly is that possibility that in some cases it doesn't work well.
Thank you. Can you speak to the data science capacity that you built within the enclave? I think something that's always hard to convey in a presentation like this is what a monumental effort that actually was to get this data into the enclave and to be working with it in the enclave. So I'd love to hear comments about that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think we were definitely the beneficiary of having the data already on there. So there was, I'm sure, a whole process that our project lead Jenny would be able to talk about of actually getting onto the enclave. But in terms of what we're able to do, you know, there's a lot of issues. Oftentimes we're reading data sets that are in the hundreds, you know, hundreds of gigs worth of data. And it's really, it takes a lot of time to read that in, especially if you don't have like cloud services. You know, big data usually is backed by all these supercomputers and cloud services and parallel processing that you can just quickly upload and do all the data. But, you know, oftentimes we had to read in a data set and just leave it overnight and hopefully sort of crossed our fingers that the next day it had read. So ways that we try to kind of expedite some of this process is actually by building a SQL database, which is generally a little bit more optimized for working with data and reading in data and merging data in general. So, and that was part of our deliverables in general to kind of the next group that's going to be looking at that is creating a sort of workflow that will expedite the process. So you're not sitting there for 12 hours waiting for data to read, as opposed to actually looking at the meat of the data.
Thanks, Chris. So I think we'll wrap up with a final question. And I like this one. I think it's because I know it's something you guys did talk a lot about and care a lot about. And so the question is, be curious to know if there are thoughts on what a good minimum wage number would be. He says, seems out of scope for this presentation, but maybe you all discussed and discovered something that wasn't presented. And so just thought I'd throw that out as an opportunity to kind of talk about that question and also other things that haven't come up and, you know, and that were active discussions within your group that you're excited about.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure if we have a consensus. I know Jenny has published papers and other people in the Seattle minimum wage study have made more formal recommendations. I think just based on our low wage estimates or the estimates for what a low wage worker is, I think for me personally, I would advocate for something above $19 an hour, maybe even above 20, combined with, as we noted, more public investment in affordable housing. I think something that this project's really revealed is, or really brought to light, is how it's not just about the hourly amount, it's about all these other aspects of low wage workers' lives. And importantly, housing comes into play. And in fact, most people, what they've referred to, you know, sort of the housing affordability crisis, but really we contend that it's probably an income inequality crisis.
Yeah, and if I could add real quickly, before moving to Washington, I lived in Pittsburgh, which at the time when I moved there, it was noted as the most livable city, right? And then when I got there, it made me question livable for who, right? And then when I moved to now, when I'm here in Washington, I was recently looking up best states for quality of life, and Washington was #1, right? And so once again, I had to ask the question, quality of life for who? And I think the minimum wage is one indicator, one metric that can be used to enhance a person's quality of life, as Delaney was saying. And so while I am an advocate for raising the minimum wage, I think there are many other aspects within our society that need to be attended to as well, in terms of the housing inequality, the income inequality, and many other things such as childcare and et cetera. But it's a great question. I don't have a definitive answer, but I think it's a multi-pronged issue.
Yeah, I'll round it off just to say, echoing both of them and thinking about what living wage looks like as opposed to the minimum. I think even its definition, makes you question things. But there are some resources. I know we looked at, like, University of Washington has like a self-sufficiency standard that they looked at, and that was like, how do you think about meeting adequate needs that takes into account like the things that Lamar and Delaney both said. And then MIT also has something that they call a living wage calculator, and it does it for different counties based on kind of expenses that have to do with more than, kind of how much you're making, but like all of the expenses around childcare, et cetera. So that those are, I think, great resources to like get us thinking about it, but we don't have a great answer yet.
Thank you, guys. I knew this was something that was prompted many discussions within your group and is an active area of interest amongst all of you. So thank you for responding to that. And thank you for your presentation once again. Given the time limitations, we'll turn to our next team and we'll catch up with you to celebrate later. So I'd like to turn to our second team, and they'll be presenting on developing ensemble methods for initial districting plan evaluation. Take it away, you guys.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. As Sarah mentioned, the title of our project is Using Ensemble Methods for Computational Redistricting. It's a bit of a mouthful, so we generally refer to ourselves as the redistricting team. My name is Ryan Gorn, and I'm joined today by the three other fellows, Rowana Ahmed, Catherine Chang, and Michael Souffrant. Our project lead is Daryl DeFord, and the data scientists advising our team are Vaughn Iverson and Bernice Herman. Today, we're going to be sharing with you the outputs of our work over the last 10 weeks and how we see this timely project fitting into the congressional redistricting process that is currently happening. Of the 435 seats that make up the US House of Representatives, 89% of them are currently considered safe. This means that in what is purportedly one of the most democratic nations in the world, only 11% of elected representatives are likely to be voted out of office. Meanwhile, Americans' approval rating of how well Congress represents them has averaged less than 20% over the last decade. And yet nearly 90% of their seats are unlikely to change hands. This reality fundamentally undermines both the spirit and practice of democracy. A major reason for how we arrived at this representational disconnect is through the strategic manipulation of electoral districts. Under the current system, politicians have been allowed to pick their voters rather than voters picking their politicians, a practice which runs counter to everything that democracy is supposed to embody. The manipulation of electoral district boundaries for personal or partisan gain is commonly called gerrymandering. Though it is most often talked about in terms of partisan outcomes, racial gerrymandering to dilute or suppress the voices of certain demographic groups also frequently occurs, either by clustering those groups together to limit the number of seats they can get, or by separating them into many districts to dilute their votes. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with this concept, but a bit of background is warranted to understand exactly how this process works and why it has become so prone to partisan exploitation. The Constitution mandates that the population of the US be regularly counted and that changes in the population be used to reapportion the seats of the House of Representatives so they remain proportionally distributed within and across states. Thus, every 10 years after the census, all 50 states must engage in a process of redistricting, or redrawing the geographic boundaries of their congressional districts. Importantly, this process is largely controlled by state legislatures, who either draw new district boundaries themselves or refer the process to a committee of their choosing. Each state has its own rules for this process, and there are always trade-offs that must be considered when dividing up a state into electoral districts. But since district boundaries have so much power to shape the dynamics of political representation and influence the outcome of future elections, this is always a contentious and politically charged process, which creates incentives for gerrymandering. Though gerrymandering has been a persistent problem in the United States for over 200 years, as this graph shows, the problem is getting worse. On the y-axis, you can see the number of seats in the House, and on the x-axis, the time since 1997. The two solid vertical lines are census years, which mark when district boundaries are redrawn, and the dotted vertical lines is the first congressional election using those new maps. So as you can see, after new maps were adopted in the last 2 cycles, we see a notable increase in safe seats for both major political parties and a corresponding decrease in the number of competitive seats in the purple. In large part, this is because both major political parties have become increasingly adept at using computational geospatial mapping tools and voter databases to create safe districts for political parties and individual politicians with high accuracy. In an intensely polarized political climate, neither major party is likely to unilaterally disarm by refusing to gerrymander when they have the power to do so. Thus, we are unlikely to arrive at a political solution to this problem. Instead, we need to democratize the process of redistricting and empower citizen groups, activists, and nonpartisan map drawing commissions to become more involved, to monitor redistricting committees and the maps that they produce for potential gerrymandering before they are adopted, or to challenge the maps in courts that give outsized influence to some while diminishing the democratic voice of others. This has been the primary motivation for our work this summer. The current redistricting cycle is the first in which computational tools designed to assist with this process have been developed and made publicly available. So our focus as data scientists interested in making a social good impact has been to democratize access to one of these computational redistricting tools in particular, GeriChain. In the rest of the presentation, we're going to briefly explain why GeriChain is such a powerful tool for computational redistricting, summarize the insights we gained from applying GeriChain to unique redistricting problems in 3 states, and finally discuss the user guide we developed to help make this tool more accessible to the general public.
So before diving into the details of GeriChain, let's first look at a toy example on the process of drawing district maps. If we consider a 5x5 grid and we try to segment it into 5 districts that are each contiguous and composed of 5 blocks, you could see that just a single 5-block district that starts at the top right-hand corner can take 35 different shapes. If we fill out the grid and draw 5 contiguous districts of 5 squares each, then there become 4,006 different maps that we can draw. As you can imagine in the real world, the problem explodes in complexity. For example, Washington State has 4,667 voting precincts that need to be partitioned into 10 districts, much larger than a 5x5 grid. In fact, computational redistricting experts have stated that the real number of possible district plans for any state would be greater than all the atoms in the known universe. So to explore this giant universe of potential maps, we use Markov chain Monte Carlo sampling methods, or MCMC. The idea behind a Markov chain is based on a random walk. Here you have a sequence of states where the next state only depends on your previous state, so there is no long-term history. And the more steps one takes, the more configuration in the state space we explore. We then collect the plans visited at each step to create a distribution of possible plans. To illustrate this example, let's use our 5x5 grid and choose a starting plan, which lies at the center of this visualization. This is the first step of our Markov chain. Here, there are 4 different paths that can be taken from our initial starting plan. These 4 potential paths are within the state space of different configurations, but is not exhaustive. One path is randomly selected with our random walk, which moves us to our second step. In the second step, we can make a minor modification to the plan and then randomly select a plan to move us to the third step and repeat the process. The more steps we take, the more configurations in the state space we explore. So using MCMC, we can effectively sample from the universe of potential maps. And we could generate ensembles of potential districting maps using GeriChain. GeriChain is a Python library written and managed by the Metric, Geometry, and Gerrymandering Group, or MGGG, at Tufts University, and worked on extensively by our project lead, Daryl DeFord. Moving beyond our 5x5 grid, let's look at a real-world example in the state of Virginia. Now, Virginia has a bit more than 2,400 voting precincts that need to be partitioned into 11 congressional districts. Using GeriChain, we ran a Markov chain for 100 steps. This GIF shows the map generated at each step of the chain. Typically, the type of proposal you see here requires about 10,000 steps before reaching a steady state distribution, while other proposals may require millions. After we finish running our chain, we can then plot the distribution of statistics of interest drawn from all the maps within our ensemble. So in sum, MCMC and GeriChain allow us to capture the distribution of a sample from the universe of potential plans, which can help establish ensemble means, detect outliers, and evaluate current human-generated plans. So while GeriChain was developed to lower the barrier of entry for the use of computational redistricting tools, as with any tool, its use requires careful thought and consideration to realize its full potential. In this section, we'll discuss 3 important considerations relative to state-specific applications of MCMC and GeriChain. Our work here informed our stakeholder guide deliverable, which assists interested users who aim to conduct similar analyses. Now, the map drawing process and legal rules for redistricting differ for each state. However, states share many similar redistricting rules. Here, we have the 9 most common rules, such as equal population balance, the preservation of political boundaries, such as city or county lines. Unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about all of them today, so we highlighted 3 specific rules. We'll discuss how we examine political competitiveness in Colorado,
partisan considerations in Georgia, and the Voting Rights Act compliance in Texas. In using Jerry chain, our first task is to translate legal language governing state-level redistricting into quantifiable measures. Colorado has language in their state constitution specifically highlighting that proposed district plans should, quote, to the extent possible, maximize the number of politically competitive districts. However, first we must address, how do we define political competitiveness? There are many different ways to define competitiveness, and there is no prevailing agreed upon standard. Today, I'll focus on just one approach, a commonly used method called the vote band. The vote band method outlines that a district is considered competitive if its Democratic and Republican vote share falls within a specific range. There are two commonly used ranges, 46.5 to 53.5% and 45 to 55%. Here, we pause to make a decision. Do we consider competitive districts to be between 46.5 to 53.5 or 45 to 55%? We selected the 45 to 55% vote band because it aligns with existing published literature and is the band most relevant to our Colorado context. So now we could set up a neutral ensemble that maximizes the number of competitive districts in Colorado. Now, in the past 5 US House elections in Colorado, using the 2012 map, only one of the 7 districts was considered competitive. Using Jerry chain, we designed a Markov chain to follow specific constraints and acceptance conditions. So it generates plans that follow a state's legal redistricting rule. That is, in Colorado, we specifically designed the Markov chain to only accept the next steps in the chain that contain plans with a greater or same number of competitive districts. We ran the chain for 10,000 steps and graphed the number of competitive districts contained in each plan explored. Here, you could see that our ensemble mean is 4 districts, which is 3 more districts than the 2012 human-generated plan. So our takeaway from this analysis is that any Colorado district plan only containing 1 competitive district can serve as an outlier, and that Colorado map drawers can aim to construct maps that have up to 4 competitive US congressional districts.
Now we're going to focus on partisan considerations as one of the many guidelines of the redistricting rules in Georgia, which also requires that state legislative district be contiguous and the compactness of redistricting maps. As such, the green boxes shown here represent the main parameters that are considered in the redistricting rules of Georgia, and the gray boxes represent guidelines that are not as highlighted for the state. Since state rules aim to achieve a total population that is substantially equal per district, the outcome of the election in terms of the political parties involved is critical. As such, we'll probe one of the built-in metrics of Jerry chain as an example to evaluate partisan outcomes. So the metric we want to focus on is the wasted votes assessment. Wasted votes, by definition, are any votes cast for either party in excess to the 50% needed to win. Let's consider this particular set of plans, which shows 3 possible redistricting plans for the same distribution of voters. Each box represents a voter. The stars represent the A party voters, and B party voters are shown as blank. Plan 1, colored in red, shows a competitive and fair plan. So we end up with a proper distribution of votes among districts, with 3 districts favoring each party A and party B. Plan 2, colored in green, shows cracked districts, with 5 districts favoring party A and 1 district favoring party B. As shown in Plan 2, the 1 district which favors party B shows wasted votes in regard to the party, since A voters are spread among several adjacent districts and B voters are condensed into 1 district. Plan 3, colored in blue, shows packed districts, with 3 districts favoring each party A and party B. In Plan 3, both A and B parties show wasted votes since voters are condensed into their respective districts. Now that we've defined the wasted votes metric and its distribution along the set of plans, we're going to focus on the approach to generate and evaluate wasted votes count per district of the state. So the state of Georgia is composed of 14 districts with 58% under the control of the Republican Party, which raises questions concerning fair voting and voting outcomes. So the first step of our analysis involved generating an ensemble of proposed plans through Jerry chain. Then we measure the wasted votes count per district per party for each plan within the ensemble. We then take a state perspective by calculating the total wasted votes count along the ensemble to generate the percentage of wasted votes for either party. Afterwards, we take a district perspective by averaging the wasted votes count for each district along the ensemble to calculate the percentage of wasted votes for either party. As such, we'll ultimately compare wasted votes percentage with the 2011 enacted plan of Georgia using the 2016 presidential election data. Looking at the state, we can first see the total wasted votes percentages of the 2011 enacted plan of Georgia for both the Republican Party and Democratic parties, which also reflects the control of the Republican Party on the state. The percentage of wasted votes for the Republican Party was close to 40%, whereas the percentage of wasted votes for the Democratic Party was over 60%. Looking at the ensemble of plans, however, we start to sampling higher wasted votes percentages for the Republican Party and lower wasted votes percentages for the Democratic Party, as an indication that the ensemble of plans are simply more fair voting outcomes. Looking at the districts in comparison to the 2011 enacted plan of the state, we can clearly see that some districts are packed in regards to both the Republican and Democratic parties. The percentage of wasted votes, however, are less pronounced for the Republican Party once compared with the wasted votes of the Democratic Party. Looking at the ensemble of plans, however, the change in wasted votes percentages is less drastic as we go from district to district, which indicates that the ensemble of plans are reflecting a more fair voting outcome per district.
We'll now shift our attention to Texas, which follows a subset of the common redistricting rules highlighted here in green, like maintaining population balance and preserving county lines. Due to Texas's current political landscape, we thought it would be timely to focus on compliance with the Voting Rights Act in the state's context. So Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, passed in 1965, prohibits states from practices that result in denying or abridging the right of US citizens to vote based on race or color. It goes on to say that a violation occurs if a political process, such as redistricting, results in unequal participation for specific groups. Thus, the VRA strictly prohibits members of a protected class from having less opportunity to participate in electing representatives of their choice. Texas in particular has a contentious history complying with the Voting Rights Act and has faced several related court cases in the past decade. Advocacy groups, both in Texas and nationwide, are concerned about protecting minority voting rights in the upcoming redistricting cycle. The upcoming cycle also aligns with substantial population growth in Texas. Over the past decade, the population has grown 15.9%, largely driven by Hispanic groups. And this has resulted in 2 new congressional seats being allocated to Texas. However, the growth has been unevenly distributed, and many counties actually have seen a declining population. As Texas considers where to place these 2 new seats, it'll be important to not only account for demographic changes and changing population patterns, but to also ensure that minority groups are fairly represented. So to decide whether a plan complies with the Voting Rights Act, analysts can consider whether the districts that are being created are effective for minority groups to achieve fair representation. Researchers at the MGG Redistricting Lab have designed a method to quantify this by considering a district to be effective if it is one where a minority preferred candidate is able to both seek nomination during the primaries as well as win the general election. So using Jerry Chain, what we're able to do is examine how a VRA conscious ensemble compares to a base ensemble of plans that only considers population balance, contiguity, and county line preservation goals. As you can see in the 2 graphs, if we add an additional constraint when designing plans that preferentially selects plans with more minority effective districts, we'd be able to design plans that have 2 to 3 more minority effective districts on average based on the 2010 data. So this really highlights how vastly plans can differ if minority representation is accounted for during the design process. With this in mind, if we now think ahead to the upcoming cycle and consider options for where the 2 new districts might go, it's important for us to remember that the placement of these districts is crucial to fair representation. So what we're showing here is the difference in the average number of districts per county in our ensembles when we compare 2010 plans to 2020 plans. So the green regions are areas where we expect to see a higher number of districts in 2020 than 2010, and the brown areas are counties where we expect to see a decrease in the number of districts. So to take a deeper dive, we focused in on the Dallas metro area and the Austin metro area, which falls in Hayes and Travis counties. If we only consider the population differences over the last decade, Then in the zoomed in maps on the top row, we can see green regions corresponding to areas that our ensemble analysis indicates could be likely candidates for adding a new district. However, if we build our 2020 ensemble by prioritizing adding more minority effective districts, then the landscape of options changes. For example, when only accounting for population, both Hayes and Travis counties are potential candidates for a new district. But if we want to maximize the number of minority opportunity districts, then on the bottom row, we can see that Hayes County is actually a much better option than Travis County. Similarly, it would be better to place a new district and select Dallas suburbs that are shaded in green in the second row if we want to better comply with the Voting Rights Act. As you can see, the Jerry Chain Library allows for nuanced analysis on possible trade-offs when considering where these new districts could be placed. So we've used these 3 case study results to inform a stakeholder guide that will help democratize the computational resources we use this summer and allow for more users to engage in these types of analysis. Working through these state-level case studies has really underscored the complexity of modeling decisions that are left to the discretion of those evaluating plans. Modelers must be able to carefully tailor their analysis to state-specific contexts. And so we've compiled our lessons learned from this summer into a guide, which can be found on our website later this week. This guide provides a set of generalizable rules for users of the Jerry Chain Library to apply to redistricting problems. The guide is geared towards community members, activists, and independent electoral commission members who hope to engage with the redistricting process. The guide provides an overview of using Jerry Chain, and the Getting Started section covers the analysis process from data wrangling through calculating and interpreting metrics. State-level case studies provide deeper dives. This guide can accompany users through their analysis journey and provide key junctures where a user should slow down or pause to consider decision points more closely.
Ultimately, we want that the stakeholder guide can further the core principles of fairness. Our team has discussed 2 complementary and related applications of fairness in the redistricting process. The concept of fairness in terms of output, that is, are the final maps fair, and also is the map drawing process itself fair. Fairness for the process focuses on maximizing inclusion and transparency in map drawing, and the guide can serve as part of a larger effort to democratize resources, computational tools, and knowledge on this political process. In terms of outcome, we view fair maps as those that are structured for equal representation of voters. Explicitly, we define fair maps where each person's vote has the same impact as any other person, which relates to the one person, one vote view. This past Thursday, the US Census Bureau released the 2020 census results, which kicked off formal map drawing processes. So this project output and impact are very timely. As our DSSG project timeline comes to a close, the 2020 redistricting cycle is just heating up, and the stakeholder guide and case studies will equip community members with the resources they need to engage with the process more meaningfully. We'd like to thank the University of Washington eScience Institute and our sponsor Micron for making our work this summer possible. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Wonderful presentation. Please join me in some virtual applause for the redistricting team. Great. So we have some questions coming in. I'll just encourage everyone to drop your questions in the Q&A. If you drop them in the chat too, that's fine. We can track them down there too. So our first question is, in evaluating political competitiveness, i.e. Republican and Democratic vote splits, how do you assess how a district voter would vote? How often do districts change their voting preference?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and that really reflects about the data that we use for these analyses. So we actually look at state and congressional races within the state that we're looking at, and we specifically tracked from 2012 to 2020 the number of districts that would be counted as competitive based on the results from, let's say, the US House races for 2012, 2014, 16, 18, and 20. And we could also reflect user preferences by looking at state level races to see whether the district boundaries reflect certain types of voter behavior.
Thanks, Catherine. Do you have the information to see whether whether a district is gerrymandered? Sorry, sorry, I'm struggling over the question. Sorry. Okay, do you have the information to see whether the more a district is gerrymandered, the more likely it is to be advantaged or disadvantaged in terms of access to healthcare, social services, etc., either with resources coming from their state or federally?
That's a really great question. The short answer is no, not for the analyses that we ran. But the beauty of this approach is you could feasibly import that data into a state shapefile if you wanted to run some kind of analyses like that. So while those questions were outside the scope of our analyses, it's definitely something you could do with the Jerry Chain library if you imported the additional data to do so.
Thanks. The Markov chain approach seemed to be presented as a practical way to address the impossibility of considering all possible combinations. But why does the Markov chain approach make sense from a redistricting perspective as a way of limiting the range of alternatives considered?
This is another really great question. I think a few people can probably jump in here as well, but briefly, so the Markov chain Monte Carlo combination is important here, right? So the Monte Carlo component refers to distributions that we don't actually know the distribution of. So it's exploring like this entire universe of trillions upon trillions more planets than atoms in the universe. So a larger distribution than we could ever possibly explore, but still getting some traction on what a stable distribution might look like. Now, the Markov chain using those constraints is important because we don't want to explore necessarily state or district maps that aren't actually viable, right? That don't meet the constitutional requirements of that state. So the Markov chain allows us to put some constraints in place and put some limitations on the types of maps explored so that we can only explore state spaces of maps that would even be possibly considered or enacted. I'm not sure if others have something they want to add to that answer too.
Also, we do want to just highlight that we understand the redistricting problem. There's, just like there's an entire universe of potential maps, there is quite a rich kind of field of potential solutions that, can address the issue. And so, one of the kind of great highlights of our project this summer is that, our project lead, Daryl DeFord, he actually has spent a lot of time working with MCMC methods in computational redistricting. So we were able to really spend a lot of time learning the kind of the strengths and weaknesses of this approach. But definitely there are quite a few other solutions out there that can address this problem. And we're not saying that MCMC methods is kind of the rule of the land. There are quite a few other options out there as well that I think there's a lot of great research and kind of practical work going on in.
This is an interesting question. Do you consider incumbency when evaluating competitiveness? Races tend to be much less competitive when an incumbent is seeking re-election versus an open seat.
Yeah, that is actually a great question and something that we have to consider when we're making modeling choices and working with Jerry Chain, is that especially with political competitiveness, there are all these kind of confounding factors that go into what makes a race competitive. One example is spending, right? That happens with the district that makes one more competitive than the other, as well as the incumbency effect. And so for this summer, just with our 10-week project, we just focused on like, how do we actually how do we work with the data that we have, which is election-based data, and how do we actually work with Jerry Chain to think of different ways of using election data to quantify political competitiveness within the scope of our state. But definitely there is a ton of additional work that can be done with looking at incumbency effect. I think looking at election spending would be very strong, and all of that can be fed into Jerry Chain to constrain or write acceptance functions on the ways that the chains perform. And that definitely is a area of future research that I think would really sharpen the ways that we think about political competitiveness.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I just want to underscore like how flexible the tool is. So the jury chain library allows you to do things like, for example, weigh more recent elections more heavily because that might be more predictive of future patterns than elections that are 10, 20 years old. So depending on the data you have a lot of flexibility to weigh things differently, to place more importance on certain elections over others. So it's really just a very flexible tool to let you explore this redistricting space.
Thanks, Rana. With the wealth of census data, but the infrequency with which some districts are redefined, is there a potential to extend the library to help predict more fair districts with future population growth in mind?
I wanted to add with that, for instance, that's going on right now with Georgia. So the 2010 census of Georgia showed that Georgia had over 9 million people. And now it has 1 million more, so it has 10 million. So they have to not only consider the new redistricting rules, but they also got to consider the population increase. So that's why, for instance, they have to come back every 10 years in order to redo the redistricting and change the boundaries. And also with new rules and new boundaries, and sometimes you have new political members that have current positions, and you have to also take that into account. So that's currently the wasted votes percentage that we do in Georgia correlates well with the new plan that they're trying to derive, I think, fall of this year. And I think that goes well also with the increase in population.
Yeah, and there's also in the guide that will be on our website later this week, we kind of talk through some of the data wrangling that users might need to do. And part of that is definitely kind of merging different population demographic data, which could be projected data into the state shapefiles that we're using. So there's definitely a lot of potentially even like predictive analysis that could be done if you're trying to use some projected data.
Great, thanks, Rowana and Michael. This is a great wrap-up question, I think. So looking forward, curious what you all think about getting these tools and this analysis to the necessary people who will do the redistricting. And what's the plan for communicating a pretty complex and new set of tools and technology to stakeholders whose area of expertise may not be data
science? Well, I just want to jump at it real first. So I think the first step is just to make the tool very user-friendly. Because for instance, for us, when we got first exposed to Jerry Chain, since it's a Python-based software, we had to basically like understand not only the metrics, but how to implement those metrics. And then one thing that we're working on, for instance, is our Jerry Chain guide, where we basically take all the information that we learn on Jerry Chain, all the metrics, and also these examples that you're seeing in this presentation as a summary to basically simplify and clarify the idea of Jerry Chain, where users can now take that and then use it in a practical way in whatever state of interest that they want to look at.
Yeah, and I think that really highlights the kind of process that we went through this summer. Is really, this is the first time that we've worked with Jerry Chain as a tool, and we really wanted to document our work, like our learning process, but also just be really transparent about the decisions that we made with the modeling choices. And that's what the case study is really going to underscore. And to answer your question about how do we get this into the hands of the necessary people, I do want to highlight that, we're not working in isolation, right? We kind of mentioned a couple of other groups that are doing this work. For example, the group at Tufts, the Metric Geometry and Gerrymandering group, and our project lead, Daryl DeFord, has also created like an entire wealth of resources and learning materials that we are trying to be in conversation with. That there are folks interested in Jerry Chain, and there's quite a rich set of documentation out there. So our user guide is to supplement folks that are maybe already engaged with Jerry Chain, and really being more clear about the learning process necessary to kind of work with it. And also through those connections, we've been able to connect with other stakeholders. So we've talked to stakeholders in Texas, in Chicago, as well as a data hub that works nationally, and that there's a lot of interest around these tools. and that, I think our project lead and, a few of us, we're still interested in having these conversations and pushing this out to people and, accessing the network of interested stakeholders who are kind of getting engaged with the redistricting process currently.
I would just add to this, because this is a fantastic question. One of our big motivations for this summer is this tool is amazingly cool, but as you pointed out in your question, amazingly complex. So how do we sort of democratize access to it in some way? As I'm sure all of you also gleaned that sitting through this talk, the problem space is also very complicated, right? We have to know something about mathematics, about political science and public law, as well as the sort of analytical tools and coding language of Python. So we recognize there are a lot of barriers to sort of taking up these tools. And the guide is both designed for people who maybe have some, even a modest background in some of these technical skills, but we really tried to design it in a way that would provide enough context and sort of fill in those gaps, as well as by linking to a bunch of other resources that a diverse array of stakeholders could potentially take up this guide and sort of familiarize themselves to Jerry Chain enough to be able to use it, or at the very least understand the outputs that it's creating and how the software works.
Thank you, guys. Well, everyone, please join me in thanking both of our teams once again for their presentations today, and just the remarkable amount of work that gets done in what ends up being a relatively short period of time. I'm sure the students would reflect that it feels like a very, very short period of time that goes by way too fast. So I just wanted to just have a couple notes here at the end. Just to note that over 70 people participate in and support this program. And this goes from joining us on career panels to teaching tutorials, being available on Slack language helplines. Within the eScience Institute, we are lucky to have such a dedicated and talented group of individuals who constitute the core of this program. In particular, I would like to call out DSSG Program Chair Anissa Tanweer for her leadership and guidance, and her insights, which have really been invaluable to the development and maturation of the University of Washington Data Science for Social Good program over the this is our 7th year of running this program. And so we're just really thankful for the group of people who come together and make this program happen every year and give us the opportunity to work on these exciting and meaningful projects and to engage with this interdisciplinary and innovative group of students that comes together from across the country and from our own university. I'd also like to lastly thank all of you for joining us today, and just to let you know that you can expect to receive a follow-up email with a link to these presentations so that you can share them, rewatch them, share them with others, and rewatch them. And we'll link to the project websites that the teams are putting together and the other resources that they've compiled as part of their project. So thank you again for joining us today, and cheers and goodbye for now.